In the aftermath of the Second World War, when Europe's ruins still smoldered and millions struggled to comprehend the scale of destruction, governments quietly locked away certain files that never made it into the history books. These were not the battlefield tales of tanks rolling through Normandy or bombers streaking across the night skies of Dresden. These were colder, darker records, dossiers stamped top secret, sealed in steel cabinets, or hidden deep in Soviet, German, British, and Japanese archives. They spoke not of celebrated victories, but of programs so ruthless, so cruel, and so strategically concealed that even whispers of their existence carried the threat of imprisonment, or worse. The fragments that did emerge were often dismissed as rumors, buried under denials, or intentionally misfiled to mislead investigators. But decades later, as classified documents were declassified, survivors finally dared to speak, and long-suppressed testimonies resurfaced. The truth began to leak out like poison through cracks in the official narrative. What was revealed was not merely the savagery of war, but the secret mechanisms of power, the betrayals of allies, the exploitation of human lives in laboratories, and the weaponization of starvation, disease, and fear itself. The real war was not always fought on the battlefield. It was waged in shadows, in underground bunkers, in hidden camps deep within frozen forests, and in the corridors of intelligence services that knew more than they ever admitted. Tonight, 4 hidden files will be reopened, 4 suppressed stories brought into the light, their contents read as though from the original classified reports. Once revealed, they cannot be forgotten. Chapter 1: Operation Iron Wolf Siberian Camps. In the frozen expanse of Siberia, beyond the reach of most maps and long concealed from the public eye, there exists a trail of documents once locked inside Soviet NKVD vaults. The files, coded under the chilling designation Operation Железный Волк, translated by Western analysts as Iron Wolf, describe not a single military campaign, but a sweeping program of forced deportation and elimination that unfolded during the harsh winter of 1944. Unlike conventional battles marked by clear front lines, this operation targeted the most vulnerable. Civilians accused of collaboration with the advancing Wehrmacht, villages suspected of harboring sympathies for the enemy, and entire communities whose only crime was being caught between 2 brutal regimes. The records indicate that convoys began departing from western Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic territories as the Red Army reclaimed ground from German forces. Men, women, and children were loaded into sealed cattle cars under NKVD supervision, their possessions stripped away, their destinations left unspoken. The manifests, written in meticulous Cyrillic, tell only half the story. Pages list thousands of names, often without birth dates, sometimes replaced by mere initials. But in the margins of certain surviving copies, scrawled notes from lower-ranking officers hint at the unrecorded truth. Whole trains that vanished without arriving at their supposed labor destinations. Journeys that ended not at camps but at unmarked sites where snow and ice buried the evidence. Those who did arrive at Siberian Gulag, sectors like Kolyma and Vorkuta, were condemned to toil in conditions designed not for survival, but for annihilation through labor. Prisoners were forced to mine gold, coal, and nickel with inadequate tools, bare hands numbed by temperatures plunging to -50 degrees Celsius. Guards were under orders from SMERSH, the Soviet counterintelligence agency, to treat deportees not as prisoners of war, but as enemies of the state. Eyewitness fragments describe men collapsing in the shafts, women frozen to death during endless roll calls, children succumbing to frostbite within weeks. Entire barracks would be reduced to silence overnight, their occupants erased from records by simple ink strokes, as though they had never lived. Western intelligence agencies learned fragments of Iron Wolf through intercepted transmissions, yet no full picture emerged during the war. The Allies relied heavily on Soviet cooperation to defeat Nazi Germany, and thus reports of Soviet-led civilian exterminations were either suppressed or dismissed as enemy propaganda. The silence suited Stalin's regime, which had perfected the art of erasure. Local commanders submitted falsified reports claiming high productivity in mines, citing thousands of laborers whose bodies had already been discarded beneath frozen earth. For those who survived long enough to be released, life after the camps offered no reprieve. NKVD agents followed them back to their villages, issuing threats to ensure their silence. Entire families lived under the shadow of black vans that could arrive at any hour, their doors slamming shut like the lid of a coffin. The physical environment itself became a weapon. Archival weather reports confirm relentless blizzards across Kolyma during January 1944. Storms so violent that visibility dropped to zero. Prisoners were marched into the snow for disciplinary drills, left to wander blind until their strength failed. In Vorkuta, reports describe special isolation barracks constructed without insulation, where prisoners were forced to endure nights of Arctic cold as punishment for alleged sabotage. Declassified engineering diagrams reveal shackled laborers building hydroelectric stations, their skeletal frames collapsing under the weight of frozen concrete slabs. Each site functioned as both camp and graveyard, with death woven seamlessly into the machinery of production. The few testimonies that surfaced decades later often came from those who escaped not through liberation, but through collapse of the system itself. After Stalin's death in 1953, Khrushchev's limited reforms allowed certain Gulag survivors to return westward. Among them were fragments of voices speaking of Iron Wolf, of trains arriving at sidings where guards vanished into the night, of bodies stacked like cordwood, of vast frozen pits that served as both mine and mass grave. One survivor, whose testimony was smuggled to the west through Helsinki in the 1960s, described how an entire convoy from Vilnius disappeared in transit. Families waited in Siberian settlements for their relatives, but no train ever arrived. When pressed, camp officials produced forged documents claiming the convoy had never existed. What remains today are only shards of documentation. Soviet authorities destroyed the majority of files in the late 1940s, during what internal memoranda call Operation Purge of the Archive. Yet Western intelligence recovered microfilmed copies of certain orders, intercepted through defectors and covert channels in East Berlin. File fragments labeled NKVD Directive 47B instruct local commanders to ensure permanent silence regarding deported subjects and to expunge all clerical references from municipal ledgers. These instructions reveal the intent was not merely punishment, but absolute erasure, a policy designed to rewrite demographic reality itself. Historians who have pursued Iron Wolf face significant obstacles. Access to Russian state archives remains tightly restricted, with entire folders missing or reclassified. Researchers who probed too deeply in the 1990s reported surveillance, threats, and sudden visa cancellations. Even today, certain burial maps discovered in the tundra are confiscated under the pretext of protecting national security. The Russian Federal Security Service, successor to the KGB, continues to classify Iron Wolf as a matter of state secrecy. This ongoing suppression speaks to the scale of what lies hidden. Not isolated abuses, but a coordinated system of civilian liquidation across the recaptured territories of Eastern Europe. The question that haunts those who study these events is not whether Iron Wolf occurred, but how many lives it claimed. Estimates range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. Without complete records, the true number remains unknowable. What can be pieced together, however, paints a picture of an operation that rivaled the brutality of Nazi deportations, carried out under the banner of Soviet liberation. It demonstrates the cruel paradox of the Eastern Front, that in fleeing one tyranny, countless civilians fell directly into the grasp of another. The silence surrounding Iron Wolf is not merely the absence of documents, it is the deliberate suffocation of memory. Villages emptied of entire generations bear no plaques, no memorial stones, no public recognition of what was done to them. Their names are absent from war memorials, their deaths unrecorded in census statistics. For decades, survivors carried their stories only in whispers, passing fragments to children who dared not repeat them aloud. And yet, within certain declassified Soviet weather reports, railway schedules, and obscure budgetary memos, the outlines of the operation remain, enough to confirm its existence, enough to expose its intent, enough to prove that behind the myth of the Great Patriotic War lies a darker truth, one the state never intended the world to hear. Iron Wolf was not a battle. It was not a campaign in the traditional sense. It was an act of silence turned into policy, a war against memory itself. Those who vanished into Siberia became ghosts whose voices were strangled not only by the cold, but by the calculated machinery of the state. And though the Soviet Union has long since collapsed, the shadows of its archives still guard the full truth of Operation Iron Wolf, leaving the world to confront only fragments of the horror buried beneath the snow. Chapter 2. Gestapo Feel, Number 17. Paris. In the dim corridors of 84 Avenue Foch, the Gestapo headquarters in occupied Paris. Fear lived in every echoing footstep. It was here, in 1942, that a file was quietly compiled under the innocuous designation, File Number 17. Within the thousands of folders detailing arrests, interrogations, and deportations, this slim dossier carried no official seal of notoriety. Yet its contents reveal one of the Reich's most carefully guarded secrets: the systematic abduction of French intellectuals, scientists, and mathematicians, taken not for punishment, but for exploitation. What was once dismissed as rumor is now confirmed through declassified microfilms and handwritten directives preserved in German and French archives. The story begins in March 1942, with an order from Reinhard Heydrich, then head of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA. Documents recovered after the war, coded RSHA 44A Tech 17, specify that priority extractions of French specialists were to be undertaken by Sonderkommando 4J, a unit reporting directly to the Gestapo. These operations targeted laboratories, universities, and even private residences. Under cover of night, black uniformed officers raided homes in Paris, Lyon, and Toulouse, seizing physicists, chemists, and engineers. The abducted were not placed in ordinary detention camps, but loaded onto clandestine trains bound for facilities such as Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, where Werner von Braun's rocket program accelerated, and the Mittelwerk tunnels at Nordhausen, where the V2 missiles were assembled in darkness by forced laborers. One French mathematician, Dr. Émile Boulanger, disappeared from his apartment near the Sorbonne in June 1942. His name never appeared in official German arrest lists, nor in Red Cross deportation files. Yet within Gestapo file number 17, his initials appear beside a coded reference: Transfer, PNM. When Allied troops overran Peenemünde in 1945, fragments of his notebooks were found in a barracks, detailing advanced calculations on projectile trajectories. His fate remains unknown, though most assume he perished in the bombings or executions that followed. He was not alone. Historians have identified at least 40 other names in the margins of the file, most of whom simply vanished into the machinery of the Reich. The Gestapo ensured compliance through psychological terror. Surviving interrogation transcripts reveal threats of reprisals against family members left in France. One directive dated July 1942, signed by SS Sturmbannführer Kurt Lischka, demanded absolute cooperation from extracted assets and authorized the arrest of relatives as leverage. French archives confirm that several wives and children of abducted scientists were later deported to Drancy internment camp, their fates sealed in Auschwitz. The brutality was precise, calculated to strip away resistance. Those who hesitated to work were reminded that silence meant death, not only for themselves, but for their loved ones. Inside Germany, the contributions of these captives were woven seamlessly into the war machine. At Nordhausen, deep within the Harz Mountains, they were forced to design fuel mixtures, improve gyroscopic controls, and enhance the destructive capacity of the V2 rockets that later rained down on London and Antwerp. In Peenemünde, French draftsmen and engineers were compelled to assist with jet propulsion systems, advancing projects like the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. These breakthroughs were paraded by Nazi propaganda as triumphs of German ingenuity. Yet hidden beneath the veneer of innovation lay the blood and stolen intellect of abducted foreigners. The secrecy of file number 17 was extraordinary. Unlike standard arrest records, these abductions were omitted from municipal police reports. French collaborators in the Vichy administration were given no knowledge of the program, ensuring that even sympathetic local officials could not trace the disappearances. The file itself was stored in a locked drawer in Rue des Saussayes, under the direct supervision of Heinrich Müller, the feared Gestapo chief. Its innocuous labeling disguised its importance, shielding it from discovery during routine inspections. Only a handful of officers had clearance to access it, and those who did signed their names in red ink in a ledger that has survived in fragments. When the Allies liberated Paris in August 1944, the Gestapo evacuated hastily, leaving behind mountains of shredded papers and half-burned files. Yet file number 17 survived, buried beneath debris in a fire-damaged office. French resistance fighters discovered it weeks later, delivering it to Charles de Gaulle's provisional government. For years its significance went unnoticed. Only in the 1960s, when declassified documents from the Nuremberg trials were cross-referenced, did historians realize that these missing French scientists had not simply collaborated or fled, as rumors claimed. They had been systematically targeted, stolen, and worked to death under the Reich's secret programs. The ethical aftershocks of this discovery are profound. Much of the scientific knowledge extracted from these unwilling captives did not vanish with the Third Reich. After the war, Operation Paperclip transferred dozens of German scientists, including Werner von Braun himself, to the United States. The Soviet Union ran parallel operations, capturing facilities and experts in their occupation zone. In this transfer of knowledge, who can say whether the forced labor of abducted French scientists lived on in the calculations that powered Cold War missiles and the early space race? Their names erased, their research plagiarized, their legacies swallowed by the victors. French families searched for answers for decades, many receiving only silence. Inquiries to German ministries were met with denials, claims of lost files, or bureaucratic indifference. Even in France, officials were reluctant to publicize the scale of collaboration in facilitating these kidnappings. For some, it was easier to let the names fade into obscurity than to confront the complicity of local informants and police, who provided the Gestapo with lists of undesirable intellectuals. Gestapo file number 17 thus stands not only as evidence of Nazi exploitation, but as a testament to the politics of forgetting. In the end, the true number of abducted scientists remains uncertain. Some estimates suggest over 200, though only a fraction are documented. The rest were erased so thoroughly that only rumors of midnight arrests and empty lecture halls remain. Their contributions to German weapons programs are likewise difficult to trace, buried in technical diagrams that bear no signatures. What is certain is that the rockets that devastated Allied cities, the jets that streaked across German skies, and the experimental technologies that hinted at a darker future were built, in part, on the stolen minds of men who never lived to see their work. Gestapo file number 17 is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a glimpse into the machinery of exploitation that defined the Reich. A reminder that war is fought not only with weapons, but with knowledge, and that knowledge can be stolen as easily as lives. It is a reminder that beneath every celebrated technological breakthrough of the era, there may lie a hidden name, a silenced voice, erased so thoroughly that only the surviving pages of a forgotten file bear witness. Chapter 3: Tokyo's Secret Unit 100 Bioweapons. Buried within the ruins of Manchukuo, the Japanese puppet state carved out of northeastern China, a lesser-known shadow of the infamous Unit 731 operated in silence. Its official designation was the Kwantung Army Warhorse Disease Prevention Department, but inside Japanese military communiques it was referred to simply as Unit 100. Unlike Unit 731, which focused on grotesque human experimentation, Unit 100 concentrated its efforts on biological warfare against animals and agriculture. Its target was not just soldiers or civilians, but the very food supply of enemy nations. In the sterile language of military science, they sought to collapse societies through famine and plague, using disease as a silent, invisible weapon. The origins of Unit 100 can be traced back to 1936, when Imperial General Staff directives authorized the establishment of a veterinary disease research laboratory near Changchun. Ostensibly, it existed to study horse and cattle diseases to protect the Kwantung Army's logistics. Horses were still the backbone of military transport, and livestock sustained both soldiers and civilians. But the documents that emerged from post-war interrogations paint a different picture. Under the command of Major Yujiro Wakamatsu, Unit 100 began experimenting with pathogens such as glanders, anthrax, rinderpest, and plague, not to save animals, but to destroy them on a massive scale. Survivor testimonies gathered by Soviet tribunals in Khabarovsk in December 1949 shed light on the methods employed. Prisoners of war and Chinese civilians were forced to handle infected animals, their exposure designed to test how diseases might leap across species. Laboratory notes detail deliberate infections of horses, cattle, and even poultry, with results meticulously recorded. Carcasses were dissected in makeshift morgues, while pathogens were cultured in large quantities for deployment. Unit 100's ultimate aim, according to captured documents, was strategic denial of food production capacity. In plain terms, weaponized famine. One operation, codenamed Black Rain, was scheduled for 1944. Plans outlined the aerial dispersal of plague-infected fleas and anthrax spores across the agricultural belt of Siberia, targeting Soviet grain stores and livestock. Japanese strategists calculated that crippling Soviet food production would paralyze the Red Army's supply chain. Weather reports from the Japanese Kwantung Army archives indicate test releases of diseased insects were conducted in rural Manchukuo, leading to localized livestock deaths and unexplained outbreaks of sickness among peasants. While black rain was never executed on a full scale, in part due to Japan's crumbling war position after 1944, the very existence of such planning demonstrates the scale of ambition behind Unit 100 witnesses recall the secrecy that cloaked the facility. Located on the outskirts of Changchun, its compound was surrounded by electrified fences, guarded by sentries who shot anyone approaching without authorization. Locals whispered of strange odors wafting from chimneys, the smell of burning carcasses mixing with chemical disinfectants. Trucks covered in tarps moved in and out at night, carrying diseased animals to remote testing grounds. In some villages, cattle collapsed overnight, their bodies bloated and leaking fluids. Locals who attempted to bury them often fell ill themselves, a pattern consistent with anthrax contamination. When the war turned against Japan, Unit 100 was ordered to erase its existence. Directives from Tokyo, later recovered in fragmentary form, instructed officers to incinerate records, kill remaining test animals, and silence witnesses. Laboratories were doused in kerosene and set ablaze as Soviet forces closed in during August 1945. Yet not all evidence was destroyed. The Soviets captured several officers, including veterinarians and laboratory technicians, who were interrogated during the Khabarovsk trials. Transcripts of these proceedings, once dismissed as propaganda in the West, have since been corroborated by Japanese archives unsealed decades later. The testimonies confirm that Unit 100 was more than a veterinary outpost. It was a biological warfare division designed to destabilize entire nations through starvation. What makes Unit 100 particularly disturbing is the continuity of its personnel after the war. Unlike Unit 731, which faced greater international scrutiny, Unit 100's activities remained in obscurity. Many of its scientists were quietly absorbed into post-war agricultural and veterinary institutions in Japan. Some pursued careers in universities, their wartime pasts unmentioned, their expertise on livestock disease rebranded as contributions to Japan's agricultural recovery. American occupation authorities, under General MacArthur, chose not to prosecute most of these individuals, preferring to secure their research data for Cold War purposes. Classified SCAP, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, files confirm that reports from Unit 100 were collected, copied, and stored in intelligence archives. The moral cost of this bargain was silence. The consequences of Unit 100's research extended beyond the war's end. In the 1950s and 1960s, unexplained outbreaks of anthrax and rinderpest in parts of China and Korea raised suspicions that dormant strains from wartime experiments had escaped containment or been reused. Though conclusive evidence remains elusive, the patterns align eerily with what Unit 100 had studied. Farmers in Manchuria spoke for decades of barren fields where nothing grew, of wells poisoned by unseen hands. These accounts, though often dismissed by officials, echo the destructive vision laid out in the unit's research memoranda. Unlike the atomic bomb, whose destructive power was immediate and undeniable, biological weapons leave ambiguous signatures. They blur the line between natural outbreak and deliberate attack, between accident and intent. This ambiguity shielded Unit 100's crimes from the full glare of post-war justice. To this day, official Japanese history textbooks rarely mention it. Public awareness remains focused on Unit 731, leaving Unit 100 to linger in obscurity, its secrets buried in classified files and fading memories. Yet in the silence of those forgotten archives lies the evidence of a chilling doctrine, that war could be won not by defeating armies, but by starving them, by rotting their food supply, by killing their horses, cattle, and pigs. It was a doctrine of annihilation through hunger, one that required no bombs, no tanks, no gunfire, just the careful release of pathogens, the silent spread of disease, and the slow collapse of societies unable to feed themselves. Unit 100 proves that World War II was not only fought with conventional weapons, but with ideas that foreshadowed modern bioterrorism. It reveals the depth of Japan's desperation and the cold logic of its military planners, who viewed disease as simply another tool of strategy. And it reminds us that the legacy of such experiments does not vanish with the destruction of laboratories. It lingers in the soil, in the memories of those who witnessed it, and in the classified shelves of archives that still guard the darkest chapters of human warfare. Chapter 4. Churchill's Forbidden Balkan Betrayal. In the shadowy world of wartime diplomacy, where alliances shifted as swiftly as front lines, few betrayals cut as deep as what transpired in the Balkans during 1943 and 1944. Behind closed doors in London, Cairo, and Moscow, the fate of Yugoslavia's resistance was decided not by the courage of its fighters, but by the cold arithmetic of geopolitics. Recently declassified SOE, Special Operations Executive, dispatches and Foreign Office files, catalogued under FO 371, reveal a story deliberately buried for decades. Winston Churchill's calculated abandonment of General Draža Mihailović's royalist Chetniks in favor of Josip Broz Tito's communist partisans. It was a decision veiled in code names and ciphered telegrams, a decision that ensured the survival of one faction while condemning another, along with countless civilians, to destruction. The origins of this betrayal can be traced to the summer of 1943, when the British War Cabinet debated how best to stabilize the Balkan front. Mihailović's forces, aligned with the Yugoslav royal government in exile in London, had received early Allied support. Arms, money, and radio equipment were parachuted into Serbia to sustain their resistance against German occupation. Yet by 1942, British intelligence reports began painting a darker picture. MI6 and SOE operatives in Cairo circulated claims, some genuine, others exaggerated, that Chetnik units were engaging in ceasefires with Axis forces, conserving strength rather than risking annihilation. Meanwhile, Tito's communist partisans were mounting aggressive guerrilla campaigns, ambushing German supply lines and suffering horrific reprisals. In November 1943, Churchill convened a meeting of senior advisors at 10 Downing Street. Declassified minutes record his frustration. "We cannot continue to arm those who do not strike. The partisan shows fight, the Chetnik does not." That single judgment, born of incomplete intelligence and political calculation, set in motion Operation Eclipse, the codename for Britain's covert realignment in the Balkans. Beginning in early 1944, supply drops to Mihailović dwindled. SOE operatives embedded with Chetnik units received new orders: disrupt rather than assist. In some cases, they were instructed to sabotage supply caches, ensuring that Mihailović's men remained under-equipped. Simultaneously, the skies over Yugoslavia filled with British and American aircraft parachuting arms to Tito's partisans, strengthening their hand against both the Germans and their domestic rivals. Ciphered telegrams between Cairo and London, preserved in the PRO, Public Record Office, confirm the duplicity. In one transmission dated 14 February 1944, SOE Station Cairo reported, "Chetnik support terminated as per Eclipse directives. Recommend full diversion to Tito units despite known Soviet leverage." The phrase, "despite known Soviet leverage," is telling, for Churchill was fully aware that backing Tito meant empowering a communist movement closely aligned with Stalin. Yet the geopolitical calculus was brutal. Tito was effective, Mihailović was not. To Churchill, efficiency outweighed loyalty. The consequences for the Chetniks were catastrophic. As German forces retreated and the partisans advanced with fresh supplies, Mihailović's units found themselves encircled not only by enemies but by former allies. Villages that had long sheltered royalist fighters were branded collaborators by Tito's men. Contemporary Yugoslav records detail massacres in eastern Bosnia and Serbia, where entire communities were executed for their allegiance to Mihailović. FO 371 files include desperate appeals sent by Chetnik emissaries to London, pleading for renewed aid, their language growing more desperate with each telegram. None received meaningful response. Churchill's decision was not made in isolation. Stalin pressed the Allies relentlessly to back Tito, seeing in him a reliable vehicle for post-war communist control. The Tehran Conference of late 1943 marked the turning point, with Roosevelt and Churchill conceding to Stalin's insistence on recognizing Tito as the legitimate leader of Yugoslav resistance. But the operational betrayal on the ground, the deliberate cutting of supply lines, the covert sabotage of Chetnik logistics, was executed by British hands, not Soviet. SOE operatives later admitted under closed testimony that they had been ordered to mislead Mihailović, assuring him of continued support even as Churchill had already signed his fate away. Mihailovich himself was eventually captured in 1946, tried in Belgrade by Tito's government, and executed by firing squad. His trial was branded justice for alleged collaboration with the Axis, yet the reality was more complex. Many historians now recognize that the starvation of Chetnik forces by their former British allies weakened their capacity to resist both Germans and partisans, leaving them vulnerable to defeat and vilification. Churchill never publicly acknowledged the extent of Britain's betrayal, though private letters suggest he viewed it as a necessary sacrifice to maintain Soviet goodwill and secure Allied unity in the final years of the war. The most damning evidence lies in the silence of post-war commemoration. British memorials to resistance movements celebrate the bravery of partisans, but scarcely mention the Chetniks. In Yugoslavia, Tito's regime cemented its legitimacy through propaganda that cast Mihailovich as a traitor, a narrative unchallenged in the West for decades. Only with the release of FO 371 documents in the 1990s did the outlines of Operation Eclipse emerge in full clarity, revealing the cold betrayal hidden beneath diplomatic euphemism. The betrayal had long shadows. By empowering Tito, Britain ensured that post-war Yugoslavia would fall firmly within the Soviet sphere of influence, a communist federation that would dominate the Balkans for nearly half a century. The Chetniks, once hailed as early heroes of resistance, were erased from history, their memories stained by accusations that may have been exaggerated or fabricated. For the families of massacred villages, the betrayal was more than political. It was personal, a matter of survival extinguished by decisions made in distant war rooms. Churchill's forbidden Balkan betrayal illustrates the ruthless pragmatism of great power politics during World War II. It exposes how alliances could be reversed overnight, how promises of support could evaporate in the face of shifting strategy, and how entire communities could be sacrificed to secure favor with more powerful partners. It remains one of the least discussed episodes of the war, not because it lacked significance, but because its acknowledgement would tarnish the image of Allied unity and moral clarity. To read the telegrams, the coded orders, and the desperate pleas is to confront a sobering truth. The war was not simply a clash of good versus evil, but a brutal contest in which even the victors committed acts they later chose to bury. Operation Eclipse was not only a betrayal of a general and his men, it was a betrayal of memory itself, sealed in classified files and left to molder until their eventual release forced a reckoning that came decades too late. In the hidden annals of the Second World War, beneath the triumphalist narratives of liberation and victory, lie stories deliberately silenced, left to gather dust in locked archives. They are not tales of parades through liberated capitals or speeches echoing across victorious parliaments. They are fragments of darker truths, preserved in coded telegrams, burned into interrogation transcripts, and buried beneath layers of bureaucratic euphemism. What emerges from these fragments is not a clean war of good against evil, but a battlefield of shadows, where the hunger for survival and power stripped away morality. Operation Iron Wolf's deportations into the Siberian abyss remind us of the faceless civilians who vanished into the snow, condemned by ink strokes on NKVD orders. Gestapo File Number 17 uncovers the intellectual kidnappings in Paris, where genius itself became contraband for the Reich's secret laboratories. Tokyo's Unit 100 reveals the terrifying logic of weaponized famine, a doctrine that saw cattle and grain as targets in a war of pathogens. Churchill's betrayal in the Balkans exposes the ruthless pragmatism of statesmen willing to sacrifice allies and villages for the geometry of post-war influence. Each of these suppressed stories lingers with unanswered questions. How many voices were erased before they could speak? How much of our modern world was built on stolen science and silenced lives? And what other files remain sealed, hidden in basements and vaults, waiting for the day when secrecy can no longer hold back the truth? The war never truly ended in those archives. Its ghosts remain, whispering through paper, demanding to be heard.